Welcome back to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell. And this week, as every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, I do not normally respond to comments left in the comment section on a podcast. Generally speaking, most people just resort to name calling or insults or random, he never said that, things like that. But this week, I wanted to make an exception to that. And I wanted to respond actually with this podcast and the next podcast to a rather lengthy comment that I received. I thought was somewhat well written. Don't get me wrong, there's several, thinly veiled insults piled in. But I thought it might be worth responding to. And the whole point of doing this is this journey that we're taking from nothing to where we are today. And in the course of taking this journey, it's good to have good, healthy debate and to look at these things. And so I want to respond to the comments that I got from a listener. In episode 62, Cutting Down Darwin's Tree of Life, we took a deep dive on the question of the fossil record and does the fossil record support Darwin's theory of evolution? Through the whole question of the tree of life again and things like that. And of course, the answer is no, it doesn't. It didn't 165 years ago, and it still doesn't now. And then in episode 63, The Lies of Evolution, I continued looking at the other pillars of evolution, these things that are sold to us as settled science. It's really the foundation on how evolution is taught to us. And I looked at 4 or 5, I think, examples and walk through that. And we had a listener who responded to a few of those. And what I want to do this week is talk about this on a very high level. And then next week, what I want to do is to kind of jump into the actual questions themselves and respond in a little more detail to what the viewer had to say. So this week, I want to talk a little bit about the contention of what we're talking about and why I think that the viewer in question, so I'm talking to you individually, the person who wrote in, but I also want to talk to you as maybe a skeptic, someone who looks at this from a naturalistic perspective, an atheistic perspective, or an agnostic perspective. The point of all of this is to ask questions and to look and learn and figure out where we are. What is the best explanation for how we got here? And what are we looking at as we take this journey? I want to look at a quote here that the listener wrote in and said, please excuse any curtness. I lost the original comment when I accidentally clicked off your video. That happens. I can relate. And then he starts going and looking at these things. And he addresses one of the first comments that I was looking at, one of the first problems of evolution, which is the problem of missing living links. And he says here, please read what Darwin said before and after these quotes. You go off as if he said nothing, but he does address those questions because he was bringing them up rhetorically. We'll talk about that in the next episode. Darwin does attempt to provide 4 answers. None of them address the question really well, which is why I disagreed with him. I think his answers are very shallow and presume far too much that his theory is correct rather than defending his theory from legitimate criticisms posed against it. But that having been said, we'll address more of that next week. It's this next line that I really want to address and look at. And this is my concern, and this is my heart for you as the viewer, and for you as someone who I hope is searching for the truth. So he says, you need to look more closely at what Darwin said. Talk about that next week. This is what's concerning. And if he's wrong, then I'm wrong. And nothing you said has convinced me that I should look into it any further. That's a remarkable statement. If Darwin's wrong, then I'm wrong, and you haven't said anything that would convince me to dig a little deeper. A few podcasts back, we looked at this question of Pascal's wager and looking at this idea and what's really at stake in all of this. And we're not just debating hypothetical things. We physically exist. We can all generally agree to that. And there was a legitimate question raised, one of the greatest questions of all time. How did we get here? And what is our purpose? And as we address that, is there any area of life that you would look at and say, well, this is such firmly settled science. This is so firmly established that I don't need to ever test my belief system. And I guess I would step back from that and question whether or not that's a good approach. You're wagering eternity, if you're wrong, if you're wrong and there is a creator, and that creator has reached out to us and shown himself, which is why we do this podcast every week, if you're mistaken about that, then you're rolling the dice on eternity. You're looking at an eternity of separation from a creator who loves you and gave everything for you, potentially, if my contention is correct. Doesn't that warrant just a little extra look? Doesn't that warrant determining whether or not a 165-year-old theory, a theory that, again, has so many holes in it today that it looks like a block of Swiss cheese, doesn't it warrant looking and digging just a little deeper in all of this? And that's what I want to look at today. You know, I look at some of these quotes, and I walk through this, and again, a little further into his comments, he says, I think it would absolutely blow your mind to see what atheists have to say about these things. Textbooks aren't written to tackle every tiny nitpick from every rapidly shrinking community with a vested interest in not believing evolution. I take a little license here with the comment. It sounds a lot like, saying science deniers, people like you who really don't understand the science. And it's a shrinking group of you. And might I suggest, respectfully, that mindset comes straight out of the 1800s when Darwin wrote his book. When Darwin posited his theory, it was, well, he wasn't the first one who put it out there, but his was the version of it that took. And the theory of evolution became considered the mainstream theory in the decades preceding forward from that. But the idea that it is a shrinking group of people who question evolution's veracity is an absolute misnomer. The scientific discoveries of the last 100 years have shined a light on many different things, from the idea that the universe is static and has existed for forever, to especially Darwin's theories and this neo-Darwinian theory of evolution that mutation and random selection can absolutely explain all life on Earth. The scientific discoveries of the last, especially 50 years, but the last 100 years, have poked so many holes in that theory that I would argue, again, respectfully, that it's intellectually not really a place that you can hold to say, I don't need to go back and give this a fresh look. I don't need to look at this because it is settled science. Would we, in any area of our rapidly expanding knowledge base, consider anything to be settled science? If I looked at it and said, well, the universe has existed forever, and we know this because, well, in the 1800s, we knew the universe had existed for forever, and it was just a static thing. Of course not. No one would consider physics or cosmology or any of these things to be settled science. There is good, healthy debate around all of these areas. But somehow we're clinging to a 165-year-old theory of Charles Darwin's as though it were settled science, so sound that no one dare question it. And I think part of the reason why is the foundations of it are crumbling all around it. So I would like you to consider that perhaps, just perhaps, there is a growing chorus of people who suggest that evolution needs to be looked at and taught differently because of the scientific evidence that we found, the current scientific evidence, that these things are changing the landscape of how we look at things. I love Arthur Eddington, I think, put his finger on this, my goodness, 100 years ago. Eddington was quoted as saying, philosophically, the notion of a beginning to the present order of nature is repugnant. And what Eddington is hitting on there is this idea that the idea of a beginning point of the universe raises so many philosophical issues that we do not want to begin to look at. He didn't want to go there. And everyone understood where the science was pointing. Eddington famously proved Einstein's general theory of relativity to be accurate. And I think a good scientist in his day, but he captured something that even Einstein himself was guilty of. Albert Einstein, and it's remarkable when we think about this, Einstein denied the current science of the day that his own theory had created. When Einstein released his general theory of relativity, Einstein would spend the next 10 years desperately clinging to something he called the cosmological constant. And the cosmological constant, he had set at this value because what you ultimately ran into with Einstein's theory was if gravity ruled the universe, and this idea that gravity was pulling everything in, eventually everything would have collapsed back into a black hole, but it never happened. And Einstein, in recognizing that, said, well, there has to be something pushing back out against the effect of gravity. And Einstein coined the phrase that it was something called the cosmological constant. Not a bad theory at all. But what Einstein had to do was to absolutely monkey with the numbers to a point where he came up with a value that was so outrageously specific to put the universe in this steady state, this place where the universe was neither expanding nor contracting, so it could have existed eternally, so that he wouldn't have to deal with these same philosophical issues. And within a decade, it became abundantly clear that he was grasping at straws. And finally, the growing weight of the evidence of an expanding universe forced Einstein to abandon the position, something that he would later go on to call his greatest mistake. This idea of denying where scientific discoveries are leading us. You always get this idea of science being referred to in the third person. Well, if we just give science long enough, science will figure it out. Okay, science is not a person. Scientists discover things, and where the scientific discoveries of the day were leading Einstein, he fought it for a decade and was absolutely proved to be incorrect. And we don't want to be guilty of doing that same thing here. And I fear that that's where we're going down with statements like this. If he's wrong, Charles Darwin, then I'm wrong, and nothing you said has convinced me that I should look into it further. I want to think about Richard Dawkins, who is never one to back off of an insult in my experience. Dawkins, when addressing issues like this, people who question the science, said, of course, dyed-in-the-wool faith heads are immune to argument. Their resistance built up over years of childhood indoctrination, using methods that took centuries to mature, whether by evolution or design. And there's a lot of people out there going, that's you, buddy. That's you. And I hope you understand and look and recognize that this is untrue. It's amazing, I think, how many people who probably have issue with my interpretation of what Charles Darwin said, who have never actually cracked the pages and read Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. It's not really read today. And it's an interesting read. It was an interesting read. He has an enormous fascination with birds and a patch of dirt in his backyard that I don't quite fully understand. But I didn't find Darwin's theories or his use of picture painting to be terribly interesting or effective, in my opinion. And we'll talk more about that down the road. I understand his theory. I think he takes a great deal of license jumping to conclusions, assuming that his theory is true, rather than proving that his theory is true. And that is one of his many problems. But Dawkins goes after this from the perspective that this is all such firmly settled science, it doesn't need to be defended in essence. And his defenses are not very deep when he does go after them. One of his statements from the God Delusion, atheists do not have faith, and reason alone cannot propel one to total conviction that anything definitely does not exist. Okay, I want to take issue with his statement, the first part of his statement, that atheists do not have faith. And part of what we've seen in this journey is, to be quite honest, atheists have more faith than I think any group out there in any of these debates. And I know people will take offense to that, but bear with me for a moment. Atheists have faith, naturalists, people who believe in the natural order and nothing more, with growing scientific evidence pointing to the contrary of their natural conclusions, are forced to put more and more reliance on luck to get them past everything. And it's this idea that luck is the answer to all of the problems that they have, until it becomes laughable when you read and look at this. A statement like, Richard Dawkins there, when Dawkins will routinely credit luck as being the answer to how all of these things, including us, got here when you get down to it. There are multiple quotes, you mentioned some of them before, where he credits enormous amounts of our existence, of our development, to sheer luck. Exact quote, his terms. We've quoted it before, I'll quote it again here in the weeks to come. But Dawkins relies on luck over and over again. And if you think about the journey that we've been on, when you say that nothing I've said convinces you to look any deeper, To have gotten here, again, we have to go from nothing to everything in what scientists now call the Big Bang, which defies all scientific explanation. And despite, repeated theories to the contrary, there is a defined beginning point to the universe. And these ideas of leaning on multiverses or other things are all of them run into the exact same problem of how do you get everything from nothing, unless, like certain scientists have tried to do lately, redefining nothing to not mean nothing. But you have luck to get you past going from nothing to everything. You lean on luck to get you past the incredible fine-tuning of the universe, fine-tuning that is so scientifically, and I'm going to be honest here, it's not improbable, it's impossible. It is scientifically, it's mathematically impossible for all of the luck that would be needed to get us past the fine-tuning problem. So much so, even Richard Dawkins has begun pointing to that lately as being problematic for his philosophical worldview. You have our own little planet that is positioned perfectly in exactly the right spot in our exact solar system, in the exact right spot, in the exact right galaxy, in the exact place, everything that needed to come together by fortune, luck, chance, whatever you want to call it. All of these things came together and took place. And then when you look at our planet, it is not just well designed for life, well put together for life. It's not just lucky. It's infinitely lucky. All of the things that have to come together for this little planet of ours to be so friendly to life, to allow us not just to live, but to thrive. When you look at us and what it took to go from lifelessness to life, and you get statements from people like Stephen Hawking who go, well, it's just what happens. It's luck. Time and chance and matter, and eventually all of these things happen. The DNA that's inside of us, that is the most advanced computer programming of anything in the world, while we know that random mutation of computer code is always a bad thing, somehow we believe that random mutation and natural selection could somehow write the most advanced computer code in the existence of mankind, in the existence of the world, explaining mankind, and yet somehow we accredit it to luck. We look at luck when we recognize the irreducible complexity of the cells inside of us and the complex systems that run our body, things that luck could never explain, and yet we lean on luck time and time again. So when Richard Dawkins says atheists do not have faith, I would argue to the contrary. They're some of the most optimistically faithful people in the world to believe that luck can answer quite literally everything. So it's amazing when you look at this and you think about everything that has transpired. 165 years ago, if we think about what the state of settled science was when Charles Darwin released his book and proposed his theory, so many things have changed. And what I would challenge you, the reader, to do, Dawkins puts it this way. He says, if all the evidence in the universe turned in favor of creationism, I would be the first to admit it. Come on now, Richard. Is that really true? I struggle to believe that a little bit, but I'm not going to question him. In my opinion, that seems unlikely, but your mileage may vary. And I would immediately change my mind. As things stand, however, all available evidence, and there is a vast amount of it, favors evolution. It is for this reason and this reason alone that I argue for evolution with a passion that matches the passion of those who argue against it. We're in agreement on that part. My passion is based on evidence. By your own admission, there's a lot of luck involved. Theirs, flying in the face of evidence as it does, is truly fundamentalist. Is that really the case, though? Does all of the available evidence point to evolution? Does it point to naturalism? Dawkins recently was quoted again talking about this idea of fine-tuning, where he said the physical constants, things like the speed of light, the gravitational constant, the strong and weak force, most physicists agree, that if you change any of these constants by even a very, very small amount, then we don't come into existence. The universe doesn't come into existence. They have to be like that in order for galaxies to form, for stars to form, for chemistry to form, actually, and then for the prerequisites of life to evolve, need that as well. So that is the nearest approach to a good argument when talking about this idea of a good argument for a creator. Even Dawkins is having to admit that the scientific evidence that there are areas that are starting to pile up. Now, granted, he's never, I don't think, admitted that when it relates to evolution. Again, I would probably reference you back. We're going to talk a lot more about his idea of Mount Improbable. Had an episode a few weeks ago entitled Falling Off Mount Improbable, because I do not believe his theory is correct there. But as we look at this and talk about it, I want to go back to the original statement that the viewer had put in. If he's wrong, Charles Darwin, then I'm wrong, and nothing you said has convinced me that I should look into it further. I understand, and I don't expect you to believe me. I'm not a scientist. I'm a bean counter by trade, and numbers are incredibly convincing to me. But I have studied the science, and I have looked at this. I try to be respectful enough of the viewers to actually have read Charles Darwin and The Origin of Species, to have actually read some of Dawkins' work and things like that. So when I look at these things and I put them out there, I don't expect you to necessarily believe me. That's okay. This is a journey that we're taking together. The goal of this journey is to find the truth. And while we're looking at it, to determine what is the most likely explanation for how we got here. So let me challenge you. From a scientific perspective, I would encourage you to pick up a copy of Stephen Meyer's Return of the God Hypothesis. This is an excellent, excellent resource, and it's a few years old. It contains extremely current scientific discussions regarding three of the most problematic issues from a naturalistic perspective that atheists are going to have when trying to explain their worldview and the world around us. I would challenge you, the reader, especially the listener who wrote in with his or her comment on this question. I would challenge you to pick up a copy of this and read your way through it and decide whether or not the science is truly settled. This is from a scientist, written from a very scientific perspective. It is written at a level that those of us who are not scientists can understand and grasp with a little extra effort, but it's worth the read and it's worth the effort, because I'm going to be honest, you're worth the effort. You're worth putting the work in to really roll up your sleeves and answer the question, is this really settled science? Am I going to stick with a theory that's 165 years old and never actually question it? Or am I going to dig a little deeper and look at this a little bit further? At the end of the day, you are worth the price of the creator of the universe. He laid down everything for you. And I know you may look at that and say, I don't want to hear your biblical theories. Go with me for a second on this. What if it's true? What if it's true that at the end of this journey, you were to find a creator who loved you so much, he gave everything for you? That's not a bad deal. And all of the scientific discovery in the world gets us that much closer to who that creator is. Getting closer to God doesn't diminish our need for science, for understanding what's around us. In so many ways, the more we peel back the universe and what's going on around us, we see the fingerprint of God, and we see the loving care and attention that he put into it. From a creationist perspective, it brings me closer to God because I recognize the incredible work and complexity that he put into it. Every parent has that moment where they love watching their child grow and explore and learn. I remember the first time one of my kids beat me at playing chess. And it was an amazing moment to watch them actually, reach this point where they could beat me on their own without dad having to throw a little help their way. Every parent loves that. And the scientific discoveries of the last century point us to that creator. And it's not the end of science. There's no conflict between God and science. The more we reach out and we reach forward into what's around us and we dig deeper and learn these things, if we discover at the end of the day that there's a creator who put them there for us to discover, and it leads us to him, what an amazing scientific journey that would be. So I want to challenge you. Pick up a copy, Return of the God Hypothesis. I want you to start there. And don't give up on you. Don't just look at this and say, it's settled science, I don't have to look any further. Don't you want to? Be sure. You look at these things and you assume, the only reason people don't come to this conclusion is because they haven't studied. Let me challenge you on that one. Nothing could be further from the truth. And you're missing out on something extraordinary. I want to thank you for joining us this week. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for this episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. On next week's episode, we're going to go into actually the detail of the comments put out there by the commenter, because I think, in fairness, since I put this out here this week, I want to respond to your comments individually next week, which we will do. And then we're going to continue on with our journey in the weeks to follow after that. Thank you so much for joining me. If you'd like to reach out to us on our website, you can find us at prooftograce.com. You can reach us by email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. And you can find our podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, and on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.